Hi, and welcome to the Number One Comics Show, where we talk about the famous number one issues and first appearances of the beloved characters in the comic book world. I'm Tom Scioli, author of Jack Kirby, The Epic Life of the King of Comics. I Am Stan, a graphic biography of the legendary Stan Lee, and Jack Kirby's Star Warriors, The Adventures of Adam Star and the Solar Legion, and WITCHMAN, a new superhero comic book. The WITCHMAN Kickstarter campaign is going strong. In one day, it's more than halfway to being fully funded. So thank you to everybody who's pledged and spread the word of this new superhero comic. You can follow the link in the show notes below to the Kickstarter campaign to learn more about WITCHMAN. It doesn't get any bigger than this. Well, actually it does, because there's also a Treasury edition collecting the first 3 issues and then the last 3 issues of the 6-part comic book adaptation of the Star Wars movie. There's certain comics that, become game changers, Action Comics #1. This is definitely one of them. This changed comics and really defines 70s Marvel in a way, aside from just like the larger cultural implications of Star Wars. Adaptation's an interesting word too, because this was written by Roy Thomas and illustrated by Howard Chaykin. And, when you think of an adaptation, you think of, taking something from one work, from one medium and bringing it into another. But they're adapting a movie they never saw, which, is just necessitated, by just the sort of deadlines of getting a comic in place and getting it out ahead of the movie so that it can promote the movie. That was the basic idea of this, that this comic would be a promotional tool for the movie. So they had to make a comic book about Star Wars, which hadn't come out yet, wasn't even finished yet, and was about to become, the biggest movie ever, this cultural phenomenon. What Howard Chaykin, the co-creator of this comic, refers to as a cult. Really interesting piece of work. The greatest space fantasy film of all. And again, this is typical Marvel hyperbole. But, when Stan Lee says Fantastic Four, the world's greatest comics magazine, it's hyperbole, but it just happens to be true. They're just sort of lucky enough that it happens to be true. And it's the same here. You would think that this comic came out after Star Wars becomes this sort of celebrated thing. But at this point, Star Wars is this untried thing. It's one of many, swings at the bat, one of many things that Marvel gets involved in of like, okay, let's throw this at the wall and see if it sticks. I believe that, Roy Thomas, in talking with Charles Lippincott and George Lucas, I'm sure he did. I'm sure he was genuinely intrigued and interested in this project and saw tremendous potential in it. But I don't think anybody could have known, what this thing was going to become. Fabulous first issue. Enter Luke Skywalker. Will he save the galaxy or destroy it? Marvel sort of incendiary blurbs. But, that's an interesting one to consider. And it is interesting when something like Star Wars, which has sort of defined my life in a lot of ways. It's interesting to think about that of like, who is this Luke Skywalker and what's going to become of him? And it is interesting knowing the sort of hero's journey that he goes on from here. The idea that like, he could end up being a villain or maybe a bumbler, destroys the galaxy, but he's just this sort of, youth with tremendous potential. He's got his red lightsaber. I love this corner box. And again, the way Luke Skywalker's depicted, he's depicted as this sort of, full-fledged, muscled Marvel superhero. And then, which is kind of interesting with these film-based properties where Mark Hamill in the movie is not that. He's sort of like a hero in training who, sort of graduates by the end of the movie. Marvel's epic official adaptation of the monumental 20th Century Fox movie, a film by George Lucas. This cover is based on Howard Chaykin's poster, his Star Wars poster that he made in advance of all of this, and that he and Roy Thomas presented at San Diego Comic-Con prior to this, having one of those like very informal Comic-Con panels, compared to, what a Star Wars panel at San Diego Comic-Con would be like today. And this cover, it's sort of like an adaptation of that poster, inked by Steve Lehola, who would go on to ink later issues of Star Wars, but not this one. This one is penciled and inked by Chaykin. It's, one hand doing the interior art, the interior line work. The imagery of Star Wars is so fully formed in our minds at this point after a lifetime of exposure. You can see the interesting things. The X-Wings, as they're drawn here, are much more sleek, less sort of funky and blocky, but more sort of aerodynamic. Luke's got a red lightsaber, as does Obi-Wan Kenobi. Han has an orange shirt and a pink laser gun. Han doesn't even show up in this first issue. So Darth Vader's green, but that's sort of acceptable when you want to be a little free with the colors in comics to begin with. And dark green is with heavy shadows is a perfectly fine way of adapting sort of a black costume. This wasn't part of Chaykin's poster design, but in this drawing here, there's sort of like a lattice work for Darth Vader's mouthpiece, which was just vertical. It was just a solid black in Chaykin's poster. This is an interesting historical document. You kind of can't make a comic like this after you've seen Star Wars. So it's really like a snapshot of a moment in time of two brave souls doing the first Star Wars comic book before Star Wars was Star Wars. Imagine, you haven't even seen the movie. So Star Wars, Stan Lee presents. Roy Thomas, scripter, editor. Howard Chaykin, illustrator. Jim Novak, letterer, adapting the greatest space fantasy of all. I wonder what the greatest space fantasy was prior to Star Wars. If anybody has any candidates, please let me know in the comments. And just looking at that logo, it's fun to see Star Wars applied to different logos. That one, it makes me think of just another space comic, like a Ditko Space War comic from Charlton or something, adapted from the George Lucas film, a 20th Century Fox release. Look at this. Again, a comic you can only make after having not seen Star Wars. Can you picture the opening of Star Wars without having the giant Star Destroyer sort of coming down from the upper right-hand corner and, zooming down? But here's, a completely different perspective on it. Again, the Star Destroyer looking a lot sleeker than the model in the movie, sort of like a pinched nose on it. We don't really get a good shot at the Carillion cruiser. And for all we know, Chaykin might not have had any reference for it. He says that what he was working off of was, they had the script, which was an early draft of the script. And so what we're looking at here, it wasn't the finished, it wasn't what shows up in the finished film. So we have an opening crawl here, which is an early opening crawl, the one that was probably part of the screening that George Lucas had at his house for, his friends, and the one that Brian De Palma said, George, this doesn't work. You need to change this. And Brian De Palma famously rewrote the crawl into the one we know today. But yeah, Chaykin, he had production stills. There were a number of photographs that he had access to. He said he visited the ILM at that time, the early ILM headquarters, and was able to look at the various models and ships to get a sense of what they are. And it's already a very lively comic. The drawing in this, particularly the line work, is very fast, loose, improvisational, very lively. It makes me think of like this generation of comics creators at this time. You had, sort of Frank Miller and Chaykin and Simonson, and they all sort of had this sort of Alex Toth idea, and you think of the inking of Klaus Janson. They all had this sort of Alex Toth philosophy of, put as much work as you can into the pencils, and then when it's time to ink, keep that arm moving, make it fast and gestural, and then your work will have a life to it. It won't turn all of a sudden turn stiff in the inking stages. And this is the furthest I've seen that aesthetic pushed in this time. It's kind of like an out of control Alex Toth, like Alex Toth unhinged. It is a period of civil war in the galaxy. A brave alliance of underground freedom fighters has challenged the tyranny and oppression of the awesome galactic empire. To crush the rebellion once and for all, the Empire is constructing a sinister new battle station, powerful enough to destroy an entire planet. Its completion will spell certain doom for the champions of freedom. Striking from a fortress hidden among the billion stars of the galaxy, Rebel spaceships have won their first victory in a battle with the powerful Imperial Starfleet. The Empire fears that another defeat could bring 1,000 more solar systems into the rebellion, and Imperial control over the galaxy would be lost forever. This is exactly that crawl that Brian De Palma saw and then suggested edits to, or if maybe Roy has gone in and made any little changes to, as is as would be expected in a comic book adaptation. The thing that stands out to me is that in this crawl, it seems like the good guys are already winning. So I think, if you want to set up a mood and a tone and have there be a sense of danger, you shouldn't kind of have the battle already, 2/3 of the way won by the rebels. Like it sort of emphasizes the way that things are shifting and the power of the rebels, as opposed to the awesome terror of this galactic empire, which I'd want to build up that threat so that when it's finally destroyed, it's like you can't believe it. It's amazing. But that is the near future. At this moment, above the yellow planet Tatooine, a gigantic Imperial starship pursues a rebel spacecraft. Its deadly laser bolts disintegrate the smaller ship's main solar fin with a soul-searing shudder. Marie Severin, colorist. And also to note, the Star Wars novelization is already out. That came out first, and then the comic book, and then the movie. Now look how busy and crazy these pages are. Now it was Roy Thomas's call to adapt it into 6 issues, which I think was pretty smart because, as you can tell from this issue, there's a lot. You got a lot of ground to cover in Star Wars. So just at 6 issues, it's already pretty packed. You can only imagine if they tried to sum it up in 1 or 2 issues. The battle is. You think of the sort of austere white corridors where this battle takes place in the movie, and it's like this isn't the Star Wars movie. This is the Star Wars comic book, and again, maybe Chaykin and Marie Severin, the colorists, maybe they would have chosen something a little closer to that sort of Kubrick look that first scene has. But this is a Marvel comic book, so they're taking this story that they just have. The sort of blueprints for, and turning it into a Marvel comic. So lots of color, lots of excitement, explosions. These stormtroopers are way more flexible and mobile than would ever be possible in those costumes in the movie. Now the style, this is sort of like a quicker, dirtier version of the style that Chaykin did on that poster, because obviously you're not going to have the sort of time and care and attention to every panel of a comic book that you would to a poster that you're making for a different pay rate and a different schedule. And that poster, it was Chaykin sort of working in a Bob Peak illustration style, just really attractive, really great. And this is kind of, like a down and dirty, fast Bob Peak style. But again, this is comics, and down and dirty and quick and energetic is not a bad thing. And in interviews, Chaykin has sort of said on numerous occasions that I wish I'd known this thing was going to blow up and be as big as it was, because if I had known that, I would have spent more time on it. Essentially, I would have taken my time. I wouldn't have. Those aren't his exact words, but something along those lines. And obviously, he's got a sense of humor, a sense of irony, and I'm sure that's at play there too. I wonder how much of that is true, because Chaykin's other comics don't look like this. So it is interesting. There's a definite choice being made here, and whether it was a choice of expediency of, hey, I have this much time to make this thing, and I'm just going to bat it out. If it were that, or if these are sort of genuine, stylistic decisions. The results are there, and I really like it a lot. And again, it looks completely different from any other Chaykin work. And there's a lot in there. There is a sort of sense of chaos. Again, it's got some Alex Toth lines and some Bob Peak lines, but in the service of like some like very, chaotic drawing. But it's so exciting. It's so different. And it does sort of capture the era in a really nice way too. It definitely has this sort of, 70s aesthetic. We have the stuff with stormtroopers and C-3PO and R2-D2. And C-3PO, and the next issue of this, inked by Steve Leahola, doesn't look anything like this. The next issue looks a lot closer to sort of standard Marvel. Steve Leahola kind of irons out the eccentricities of this style, and to me it's not nearly as interesting. It kind of looks like just another 70s Marvel comic, where this looks a little bit special. Again, special among Chaykin's body of work, and then just special among the comics of the time. So now we're in sort of an early edit of Star Wars, where we have this scene that was shot, was filmed, was part of an early edit of the movie that Lucas screened and was eventually taken out. We've seen some of these scenes. Some of the scenes got put back in the Star Wars Special Edition, which has sort of just become the Star Wars that most people watch. But then the ones that didn't make it back into there have been shown in, sort of deleted scenes and whatnot. So this is one of them where Luke Skywalker has his Gilligan cap on, and, he's looking up through his binoculars at this space battle going on. The differences in the dialogue are kind of fun. I don't picture James Earl Jones's voice when I'm reading this. I kind of picture David Prowse's accent because I'll bet James Earl Jones hadn't yet recorded his voiceovers when this version was done. But again, because this does feel like a different view of Star Wars, an earlier sort of like more raw conception of Star Wars, not the refined, iconic Star Wars we know. Where is the data you intercepted? We're on a diplomatic mission. Liar! Where are the information tapes? This ship carries the crest of Alderaan. Is any of the royal family on board? The fool is dead. Start tearing this ship apart, piece by piece, until you have those tapes. And find the passengers of this vessel. I want them alive. Yes, Lord Vader. The body language is much more fluid in this compared to what Anthony Daniels could do in that C-3PO suit. And we get C-3PO's view of R2-D2 getting the message from Princess Leia. Things are getting hot and heavy again. I wish I could read this comic without knowing what I know about Star Wars, because I'd love to know. From what I understand, the comic was a hit out of the gate. It's familiar and original, the same way Star Wars was. It's exciting. There's a lot going on. And you do get the sense of an agenda at work, that this comic is going somewhere, that it's not, they're not just killing time. And I do wonder if the sort of raw, down and dirty, look at the way that floor is rendered. I do wonder if the down and dirty look of it is what, Joe Rubinstein was emulating when it came time to ink the Micronauts, because the Micronauts Micronauts has its own aesthetic, but it does have some of the, especially the line work in those early issues, has like an urgency that this comic seems to have. But yeah, looking at that floor. Also, Chaykin is coming at this with his own influences, Bob Peak influences, and maybe even like an advertising art sensibility. But I also wonder if he was also maybe influenced by some of the funkier storyboard illustrations that he probably had access to in making this. That they sort of have a lot of that kind of high velocity aesthetic with sort of like a 70s advertising flair to it. Princess Leia, it looks like that paralysis ray, as they call it. It looks like that hurts a lot more than the sort of stun ring that she gets hit with in the movie. Now we get another deleted scene. We find out Luke's nickname is Wormy, and he sort of shows up, and it's a lot closer to American Graffiti, and he sort of shows up, and you can tell he's kind of the nerd, and there's the older kids who kind of look down on him and call him Wormy, and his Joe College buddy Biggs has come back, and he's not dressed like a Tatooine farmer. He's looking very sporty. He's got like Darth Vader's cape. He's been to the academy and is could possibly be on his way to becoming a member of the Imperial elite. And Luke tells him about this battle going on, but he's like, Luke, you don't know what you're talking about. It's probably a freighter tanker refueling. Well, there was a lot of firing earlier. We cut back to Darth Vader. I love the way Darth Vader's face, his helmet, his mask is drawn here. And, you're seeing some of those sort of state-of-the-art illustration effects in the reflectiveness of his eyes. And back here, like this panel here, you're starting to see the lighter line work on these foreground characters and the sort of color application there, and like a very smartly done. Their escape pod has crash landed on Tatooine. If he had seen the movie, maybe there would have been the giant skeleton in the background. And the escape pod was interesting. How different it's looked in this comic so far compared to, again, the toy that it became. Well, I'm not going that way. Go on if you want to. So they split up. R2 gets zapped by the Jawas, carried off to their sandcrawler, which I don't know if this was part of some of the early art or an interpretation or whatever, but he gives it, maybe it was called a sand shark or something, but he gives it this sort of, shark teeth and eyes in the front, kind of like a, really cool look for it. I'm feeling the Toth in some of this stuff here. And more deleted scenes that I think this scene ends up in the special edition, the version of Star Wars that you would see if you purchased a copy of Star Wars from, the late 90s onward, the version that's on Disney Plus as we speak. And Biggs is saying, look, there's the rebellion going on. I've been to the academy. I could join the Imperial Navy, but I'm going to get, before you know it, if I do that, I'll be part of the Empire, and I don't want any part of the Empire. I want to join the rebels, and I'm gonna go try to join the rebels, and maybe you can, go to the academy, learn how to fly a spaceship, and then join me. Biggs is going to do that. Luke is kind of stuck at home for one more season, and they may never see each other again. We're back with the Empire. Great panel here. I like the composition. The introduction of Grand Moff Tarkin, talking about the battle station. Then we get the famous scene, I find your lack of faith disturbing. Another shot at that sand shark. This panel feels particularly cramped, but that they are kind of trapped, but just sort of the, trying to fit in this like long-necked robot. Like, I know what this is supposed to be, but I don't, this might have been a little, might have just seemed like more junk to a reader back in 1977. Again, man, really, cool compositions here. Like, if I'd characterize Star Wars comics in general, they're a little bit stiff. The artists aren't really able, and maybe not even encouraged to kind of go nuts. There's like it's like they're sort of holding back. They're trying not to mess up the likenesses. But this is the most relaxed, most comfortable in its own skin Star Wars comic I've ever seen, which makes sense since it's the first. The creators of this comic are not carrying the weight of Star Wars as it's accumulated over the years. It's kind of like, just another job, something fun, something different, but it's another job. Another famous scene where they're buying the droids, and then this one kind of blows up. This dialogue's become so iconic that it's fun to sort of see an edited version, edited for space, obviously. This is a very wordy comic. At a time when comics were very wordy. 70s comics are very wordy, but this one, because again, there's George Lucas's script, a really great script, and you want to kind of maintain as much of it as possible, but you still want a legible comic. Luke, take them to the garage and clean them up. But I was going into Tashi Station to... after you've finished your chores. So we don't get the pick up some power converters line, because if we did, Luke's face and upper body would be covered up by the word balloon. And we get these text pages, Star Wars, The Ultimate Space Fantasy, Star Warriors. Why not mention Jack Kirby's Star Warriors, The Adventures of Adam Star and the Solar Legion is on sale now. These text pages might be worth doing a video of their own at some point, but again, talking about Star Wars before you've seen Star Wars, and Roy Thomas gives his story of how this comic came about, how he met with George Lucas and Charles Lippincott, and all they had to show him were those Ralph McQuarrie paintings, and how Roy Thomas was blown away by them and really wanted to make this comic and convinced Stan Lee. And that, from this first issue, the plan is already that, okay, Chaykin is going to pencil and ink this first issue, but Steve Leihola is going to take over as inker in future issues. And from what I understand, Lucasfilm was disappointed when that change of inkers happened, that they wanted Chaykin, they liked Chaykin, and they liked what he was doing with this first issue, and didn't like the sort of, watering down that happened as the series went on, which to me is to their credit, because this is a very eccentric looking comic. It's very different. So the fact that they liked what Chaykin was doing here really speaks well for them, because I could see a less, that they wanted something that looks, that has an edge to it. They didn't want just like a carbon copy of what they were doing in the movie. They wanted, another view of this thing and something with some style. And if you look at the art in here, especially when I look at the way C-3PO is rendered, it kind of reminds me of some of the Star Wars animation that you would see, like the sort of like Boba Fett cartoon in the Star Wars holiday special. That this, again, this sort of, funky kind of, with a little bit of Bob Peak flavor kind of style was something that Lucasfilm really embraced as an aesthetic for some of the ancillary, for the sort of, hand-drawn versions of this story. And so we get the thing of, Luke discovering the hologram of Princess Leia. And then we have him telling his uncle about it. Uncle Owen, I think that R2 unit might be stolen goods. Again, this sort of, square-jawed, closer to He-Man than Luke Skywalker. Uncle Owen, he mentions the name of Obi-Wan Kenobi, and Uncle Owen, gets really angry. And, this is comics, so, you sometimes have to exaggerate a little bit for communication's sake, but it is interesting to contrast this with the performance of the actor who played Uncle Owen, who's kind of got this sort of flat affect, never loses his cool. He's a farmer. Even when he's angry, he's not going to start screaming. So it's interesting to contrast this, where he's like he's got his fangs out when he hears the name Obi-Wan Kenobi. And now, R2's missing. Luke's going to go looking for him. There's another shot of that escape pod. Again, looks really cool. I love the line work. It's also kind of like, Calvin and Hobbes. This is Toth, Milt Caniff, even Hank Ketchum. It's like a sort of classic, comics, maybe even comic strip, way of using an ink line. That you want an ink line that's got some life to it. It has some improvisation to it. I mean, you think, Jackson Pollock, you think of the 50s or something, Jackson Pollock is in the mix. Very different from what Marvel Comics has sort of evolved into. I like the sort of stylization of the Stormtrooper face, those eyes becoming like more triangular. As Luke's looking for R2-D2, he's getting the Tusken Raiders are watching. And he springs into action, in his hero pose. A lot going on in this comic, a lot of excitement, a lot of, pieces moving into place. But yet it is kind of setting the story up. And now Luke gets to be, for a moment, a Marvel superhero, a Marvel action hero, gets to spring into action. He's got his goggles. I really like this panel. I like the way the goggles, completely shade his face. Really nice choice there. Famous scene, the Tusken Raider. Suddenly, a gruesome Tusken Raider looms above the startled lad, shakes his stick in the air and comes down with it, smashes Luke's rifle, and then knocks him backward. Cool action here on C-3PO. Only his laser rifle, now smashed to bits, prevents Luke Skywalker's skull from being the same. The Gadurfi of the Sand People is a formidable weapon. I think they call it a gaffy stick in the final version of the movie. In seconds, Luke is forced backward till he staggers at the edge of a deep crevice. 3PO has already toppled into it, and now the sinister raider towers above the terrified boy, laughing his horrible, inhuman laugh. his dreaded axe blade poised to kill. That thing looks a lot more dangerous than it looked in the movie. Next issue, on to Alderaan. Cool place to sort of stop the story, making that scene like even more suspenseful and momentous than it ends up being in the movie. And again, bringing Star Wars closer to its Flash Gordon roots of Saturday morning serials with cliffhanger endings, and then even the sort of daily comic strip that it was based on. The lettering of Alderaan is so tiny here as to make it completely illegible. I don't know what anybody would have made of that word reading it in the 70s. If anybody who was there when this happened wants to share their recollection, I'm very interested in what this comic must have seemed like. Because again, my understanding is that it was a hit, that people were into it just really on its own merits. Imagine you're making a comic, and instead of going into it with sort of a blank page and sort of wondering, what's my comic going to be? You have this elaborate George Lucas script and all of these photos and millions of dollars spent already in the production of the storyline, and now you have to go in and make the comic. Like, you really have the wind at your back when you go into a project like that. And I also wonder if it's possible to make a Star Wars comic book that has the impact and can sort of bowl you over the way Star Wars the movie does. I imagine it's possible. This comic is not it. As far as I know, such a comic does not exist. But it's an interesting challenge or an interesting thought experiment. I'm Tom Scioli, author of Jack Kirby, The Epic Life of the King of Comics. I Am Stan, a graphic biography of the legendary Stan Lee, and Jack Kirby's Star Warriors, The Adventures of Adam Star and the Solar Legion. And the WITCHMAN Kickstarter is currently running, more than halfway funded at this point. Thank you to everybody who's pledged and spread the word about this very special project. We still have a long way to go, but in just one day, getting more than halfway funded, I'm really humbled and blown away by the reception. You can follow the link in the show notes below to learn more about the WITCHMAN Kickstarter. I'll see you next time for the #1 Comics Show.